Just a quick mention that our work is done by member volunteers. We all have our other day jobs, and we are also not supported by AIA member dues. We're completely supported by sponsorship and donations. So if the resources and tools that I'm sharing today are very helpful to you, consider making a financial donation to help support the work. So the framework for design excellence, as Deborah mentioned, is a suite of 10 measures, and they are integrated and holistic, and they're meant as a way to think about any built environment or construction project or design project in a comprehensive and inclusive way. And we're thrilled that the AIA has adopted this as the definition of design excellence, building on the work that we did to create it as the COAT Top 10, which is also a design competition. So what is design? For us, design has to look great and it has to work great. So it's this commingling and synergy of beauty and performance. If it doesn't do both, then it's not great design. If you look at these two buildings, you might assume that one has a better energy performance than the other. The aesthetics, the identity of the building don't always align with the actual performance. So an EUI is an energy use intensity. That's the actual metric that we would use to assess the energy efficiency of a building. So that brand and that identity, as well as the look and feel and how it functions, is really important. For us, it's very important that we lead with a vision, not with a checklist. This framework is not a list of things that you have to do to get brownie points and gold stars, but it's really an alignment framework to think about how you're approaching the project, what's important to your constituency, to the mission of the museum, and to the design professionals that are helping guide that project for you. So these are our 10 measures. And you'll see that they're quite comprehensive and diverse. And I'll just take a minute to go through some of those very quickly. The first one is design for integration. This is first because the holistic process and really establishing what the big idea is critical to the success of the project. You want to make sure you start with this and it's not something that you're post-rationalizing after the fact. You'll lose a lot of time and effectiveness and opportunity if you don't do this first. Equitable communities, really important that the buildings that we design, the projects that we fund, the exhibits that we're exploring are really rooted in the community, that they're authentic, that they're promoting to public health, safety, and well-being, both on a mental health and a physical health component, and how that might bleed beyond the boundaries of the four walls of a building or beyond the property line. How are you engaged in the community involving stakeholders in the design process as well? Design for ecosystems. So our planet is in a state of emergency right now. The climate crisis, we're in the midst of the 6th Anthropocene extinction, or the 6th mass extinction on the Earth, and it's totally human caused. So how are we being responsible stewards of the planet that we call home? And if we're not respecting the ecosystems, you know, will society remain and be able to thrive as we know it? Or will we have to completely reinvent all of these things? And how are we taking lessons from the ecology of place and using that in the design of the building or the exhibit? Design for water. Water is a critical natural resource and it's finite. So much of our bodies and human health relies on water. Social unrest and wars are fought over water, and as the climate crisis increases, the risk of flooding or the risk of the lack of water and then fires, or the risk of extreme climate events from the jet stream and the movements of the weather patterns resulting in really extreme hurricanes and tornadoes, those are all risks. How are we doing our part with every project that we're considering? Design for economy, this is really about abundance and not about value engineering and cutting cost. But how are you deciding what's really important to this project? How are you doing more with less? And how are you debunking that myth that green design costs more, that good green design costs more than just doing the right thing? Designing for energy, obviously a very critical, important part of addressing climate action and climate change, not only in terms of efficiency, but how are we reusing it? How are we generating it on site? How are we thinking about the fuel source and decarbonization? All of these very important aspects to consider. Well-being, so this is about human health, community health, biophilia, access to nature, green spaces and blue spaces, air quality, all of these things fit under the auspices of this measure. Designing for resources. How do we think about the materials that we're using to build these structures, whether or not we have material health and transparency data, whether or not the material has recycled content, what is the embodied carbon footprint of the materials that we're using, and how are we being efficient and effective in that? What are the upstream and downstream effects of the material choices that we make, whether it's related to circular economy or the social justice issues in the places that these materials are fabricated, or the environmental issues where the materials are fabricated. Designing for change. This is really about adaptation and resilience and how we're thinking about creating buildings that are long living, that they're not disposable architecture or projects that are built for the next 5 or 10 years, but they have a life beyond that. And design for discovery, one of the most important ones and very deliberate as it's number 10 at the end. Going back to that first one of integration, what goals did you set out? How are you assessing your outcomes? Is there a sense of discovery as people move through the space? Are they learning something from the building? And I think this is very appropriate and tied to exhibit design as well. So one of the resources that we've created is the Toolkit to support the 10 measures and now the framework for design excellence. You can find this on the AIA website. I have a link that I can share with all of you. And each of these 10 tiles or images takes you in depth into one of the 10 measures. We also have the super spreadsheet, which is at the moment an Excel file that you can download. And it helps you calculate the metrics to assess your output. So just to go back in detail to the toolkit, when you click on one of those tiles for any of the 10 measures, you'll get 4 tabs here across the bottom. And this is what the page will look like. So design for community is one of the examples. And you'll have best practices, high impact strategies. So I love this part of the toolkit. If you can only do one thing, you know, we have so many demands on our time and sometimes it's hard to prioritize. If this is your intention, here's something that you can do that will have a really high impact and you won't have to try to solve world peace on this project. Just do this one thing. And sometimes the list has 3 things on it and you can pick. There's a curated list of web resources and also some case studies that go further in depth on some of the exemplars that are built projects. The super spreadsheet has 10 tabs across the bottom, as well as a summary tab and a results tab. What I love about the super spreadsheet is that it's very transparent. So the calculation methodology, the benchmarks that are used are all in that last tab in the reference information. And you'll see also that the super spreadsheet gives you kind of benchmarks. Now it's up to you to decide what your goal is and what is the right threshold. So there's no judgment about good, bad, or ugly, or high performance or low performance, but it is giving you indicators on what averages are, where codes are, where other standards are, so that you can make your own decisions and establish your goals with that background information. So here's just a snapshot of some of the metrics that you might associate with the 10 measures, and you'll see that they are interrelated, that they're linked. The 10 measures don't function as independent silos. So I'm happy to answer any more questions that you might have. This was just a really quick, less than 10-minute overview to orient you to some of these tools and resources.
Great, thank you. So I didn't get to talk about housekeeping for a little bit. why don't we keep questions to the end and send them to us on the chat, and I'll keep a running list and bring it up to our speakers after Chris goes. So Chris, I will hand it to you.
Great. All right, I will share my screen. One moment.
Mhm.
All right. Can you see my screen and hear me well enough? Great. All right, I'll take it from there. So I really appreciate Julie's laying out the incredible aspiration for what constitutes superior design, and so that's very inspiring to see that. So for me, I'm going to take this in a direction toward a particular issue, a particular pressing challenge that I think that museums as well as other institutions face right now. And so I want to talk with you. The bulk of my remarks are going to be about the challenge we face in re-entering facilities and returning to work, play, recreation, and learning. To do that, I'm going to talk to you about this thing we call ARC, because I'm going to talk to you about a set of tools that are available to you, to your institutions today for free. And so I want to share that with you this very moment. But to do that, I do want to go back to something Deborah said in the beginning, is what exactly is ARC? And so ARC is part of the US GBC and GBCI family of organizations. So we are a wholly owned subsidiary of GBCI. We exist to advance US GBC's mission to provide better places for people and the environment, that overarching aspiration that we all share. And to do that, ARC is, I think of it like, if you remember back to the Hallmark like shoebox greetings, we are a tiny little subsidiary devoted to one thing: measuring, analyzing, and scoring the performance, the real world performance of spaces, buildings, and places. Our work is predicated under a holistic understanding of what green building is: energy, emissions, water, waste, transportation, and human experience in the real environment. And we exist to sit on top of a growing ecosystem of folks who are both delivering those projects as well as collecting the data and translate that into a definition of leadership. And maybe slightly different than what Julie said, we do care. We do have a specific opinion about what good is. And we do believe that we interpret energy, water, waste, transportation, and human experience with the goal of recognizing and rewarding superior real world performance. And yes, we have a specific relationship to LEED and other rating systems. So we collect data, we interpret data, and LEED uses that information in certification and recertification. However, many folks go beyond that with us. So the bulk of what I want to talk to you guys about today is something called ARC Reentry. So beginning about a month ago, we released a set of tools to do what we think of as the safe and confident reentry into facilities. And I want to talk to you about where this came from and what it means for you today. So number one, ARC has had a longstanding history of the last almost 4 years of collecting and managing information on human experience, including a minimal set of measures, including occupant satisfaction, indoor, and certain aspects of indoor air quality, CO2, TVOC. About a couple of months ago, we had folks, our users began to come to us and say, hey, this stuff would kind of be useful for re-entering our facilities, but we need a little bit more. And so what we did was we took the existing human experience category in ARC and we created a new performance category, a sixth category called ARC Reentry. And it is composed of information about how a facility is managed, its plans, policies, and procedures, an expanded set of occupant satisfaction and occupant observations, and an expanded set of indoor quality measures specifically geared toward proxies for infection risk and the management of infection. So I want to tell you a bit about this toolkit. It's been available for use for about a month. And when you go into ARC, which is free, openly available, there are no constraints on who can use it, you will see a new category. And it has, actually, we introduced, it sounds a little scary, it's not nearly as bad as it sounds, but 140 new variables to support this activity. That includes yes or no and documentation and all that kind of stuff, but there's a lot of stuff in there. And so let me tell you what is available and why. First and foremost, the basic philosophy that we've taken with ARC Reentry, which we hope is complementary, is that we are dealing with a time of profound uncertainty as we seek to re-enter and reactivate the places where we convey knowledge and teach and educate in the museum community. And one of the things, so we feel like what we're missing is an iterative management process for infection control. This is not a thing that is a once and done. In my view, it's not a thing that is particularly amenable to a one-time rating or a stamp or a certification at this moment. What we're looking to do is create the best plans and policies we can based on the public health authorities that we have access to. We need to take action, and we need to do that consistently. And we need to use our occupants to tell us if we're getting it right. And when we can, we need to take measurements, physical measurements, that tell us if things are working the way we hope. And we need to analyze those outcomes and iteratively improve our policies. And we're going to need to do this day over day, week over week, for months into the future, and hopefully months, not years. And that's what we're up against right now, in my view. So we have created a platform to do that. So this starts with facility management. And actually, if I was to redo this today, I think it actually starts with governance and accountability. Who is in charge of this mechanism? And what are, as echoing what Julie said, what is your intention and vision? And how is it aligned with public health authorities? Whether those authorities are the CDC, the WHO, your local government, or ASHRAE, or SIPSI, BOMA, whatever it is. And what specific strategies do you intend to carry out and why? Whether that is communication, signage, disinfection, screening, HVAC operations, if you have elevators, or water system operations, what is your intention and how do you plan to carry that out? And how is it informed by public health? We can create a platform to ask those questions and to align your responses in your documentation and to compare it to other projects. At the same time, the next piece is to use your occupants, not to inform yourself about whether it's working. Unlike other aspects of green building, this isn't something that is amenable to a one-time superlative approach. In other words, if you are great today, that's great. But this is something you're going to need to be great on every day, every week, every month going forward. So enlisting your occupants, whether your occupants are your janitorial crew, your employees when they come back, visitors, other people who are transient visitors in your space, to provide their perspective on what's going on in your common areas, what's going on in your back office areas, and to share their experience. If your intent is to provide signage, screening, disinfection, social distancing, what is the experience of your occupants? Do they always see those things? Do they usually see those things? Do they never see those things? How do you create real-time feedback loops? Ideally, that things that are layered on top of the tools we already use to gauge occupant satisfaction. We still want to know if they're satisfied, but we also want to engage them as collaborators in managing our space. And we can turn that into data about occupant experience. We can say, what are you collecting? And again, how does it compare to other facilities that we're working with? The last category is indoor air quality. And here we are using this not because we think that indoor air quality is directly related to disease. We are certainly not seeing disease. we are not observing disease. But we are looking for things that, based on guidance from ASHRAE, CDC, others, local government, we know are proxies for things that relate to transmission. So whether we're using CO2 to look at crowding and ventilation adequacy, whether we're looking at TVOC to look at perhaps excess cleaning and underventilation, whether we're looking at particulate matter concentrations to look at filtration, or whether we're looking at relative humidity, all of these things have a proxy relationship. Whether we are sampling these things on a handheld basis episodically, or whether we're using sensors. One way or the other, it's giving us real feedback on a proxy basis about how our spaces are working. And again, in this case, we can also understand how much data do we have? What's our data coverage? How much of our floor area are we measuring? How many of our operating hours are we measuring? And what are the data telling us about conditions in the facility? At the end of the day, our intention is not to provide a a certification or a stamp. Our intention is to link intention with outcomes. In other words, by explaining our policies, explaining why we are using them vis-a-vis health authorities, explaining what action we're taking, and linking them to occupant experiences where we can and sensor measurements, we hope to create an iterative cycle. We know there will be gaps, and our commitment is to work together to solve them over time. So we're trying to create that iterative process that, when done over time, will build confidence that we are taking the actions within our span of control to return people to our spaces safely. One of the things we do, because this is what ARC does, is we do provide what we call a comprehensiveness score. So this is not a risk score, but it says how much of the things you could be doing are you doing. So we provide a comprehensiveness score, a 0 to 100 score, that says 100 is everything we can think of. And we break that down into facility management, occupant observations, and indoor air quality. And we track it, this is critical, rather than normal ARC, month over month and year over year, we track this day over day in the platform, because we think that's the nature of the challenge we're up against. And so this is the kind of feedback that we're offering to users. We also provide them with a comprehensive report. Basically, every project can generate a 16-page exhaustive report describing what's going on. And if they prefer a scorecard view, they can get that kind of view. What are they doing? And how do we roll it up and make it generally accessible? The bottom line is, what can you do today? So ARC Reentry supports this systematic, iterative management process for facilities. Today, everyone can collect, manage, and score reentry data for free. Lead, non-lead, anybody, doesn't matter. We are working with folks across the country, and this is a free, open, and readily available service. There is an option to subscribe to get additional data and custom reports and scorecards and so forth. That's an option. But everyone can get started for free. That is, and people are. If you'd like even more information about what I've shared with you, we've published this ARC Guide to Reentry. It's up there on the ARC page today. We're at version 1.1, so it's pretty brand new. And so this is available for download. You can learn more about what we're measuring, why we're measuring it, how you respond, and some tips and tricks for using it in an institutional setting. If you'd like to learn more, we have a dedicated website. We also are working with a variety of institutions across the country. We actually posted a new article today on tips and tricks for that one of our early adopting users just posted, and we have a getting started entry. So with that, I thank you for I'm looking forward to our Q&A, and I hope that some of these tools are useful to you as we address this challenge of this safe and confident return to our facilities in the months ahead. Deborah, hopefully that's enough of a place to start.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Chris. Yeah, it's a real eye-opener, and this is all new and hot off the press, and happened after Joyce and I and Chris and Julie decided we wanted to do this webinar. And Chris said, hey, we are doing this new thing, and so we shifted gears and tried to pivot as much as we can and say, okay, let's talk about reentry instead, because we think this is, foremost in many of your minds. How do we do reentry safely for the staff and for our visitors? So that was fantastic. Thank you.
No problem.
And Deborah,
yes,
if you like, I could maybe kind of do a little bit of responding while you queue up the questions and tee that all up, give you a little bit of time. Is that a good idea?
That would be great.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Julie and Chris. I think that, both are in many ways complementary and help us look at the big picture in this whole field. I guess with AIA, which is the country's premier design organization, adopting the sustainability principle is really a game changer. So congratulations, Julie, your group, and the work that you've done. And to think that all design excellence projects in the future will be filtering this sustainability set of values is really amazing. because this can really serve as a model in many other organizations. We now currently have a successful SEA awards. Imagine using that as a working reference to encourage museum to adopt that in every category of award that we can begin to relate to. And you also provide a very comprehensive set of metrics. And in fact, one of the recent AIA Design Awards, which is the Glenstone Foundation, went to visit that recently. If someone can mute, please, that's great. It really has the embody of all the 10 principles that you talk about. In particular, the last one you talk about metrics for discovery, which is so germane to all museums, operations, and design here. That whole sense of discovery is really what the museum sector can continue to offer all of the stakeholders as well as the general public. And in the principles that both Deborah and Julie described, the adaptation strategies that AIA mentioned, that is very germane to older institutions that have been around for a long time, where the site selection was probably at a place where it's more vulnerable. So the fact that you promote adaptation strategy is really great. With our last webinar, Missouri History Museum was a lead building, as well as the current SEA Award winner, the Nordic Museum being another lead museum. I think having this platform is really helpful to help the museum stakeholders as well as the operators to think about what is beyond a good design. So this platform, I think, has been in use for a little bit, as Chris has said. Adding these few items through reentry is particularly useful for, again, the museum sector, because everyone here cares about air quality inside the museum. I believe that in addition to carbon dioxide and TVOC, now there is PM 2.5 as well measuring, and relative humidity, which is a huge thing. And Markin and I have been talking about whether or not it deserves its own webinar to really talk about air. What else I'm looking at? The particular, one additional item for AIA maybe is something to think about on the organization's end. There has been award programs with organizations like at healthcare industry organization, as well as libraries or affordable housing. You already have the specific project type award category. Whether or not there could be a future museum category is something to think about, because then it would also put museums at the same level of importance as hospitals and affordable housing. So these are just the beginning of a few thoughts, and I will turn it back over to Deborah in answering more questions.
Okay.
If I could, I'd just love to address what Joyce said about the COAT Top 10 Awards, and thanks for mentioning that. You know, as far as I could tell, I was only able to find one museum in our legacy of previous COAT Top 10 Award winners. And it's not to say that museums are not prime for this kind of thinking, or that you've already done it. I see that you've just announced 4 winners for, you know, amazing sustainable museum design. Maybe it's an awareness issue and a connecting the dots. So I'm here to say, you know, please submit, consider, you know, the COAT Top 10 Awards. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a newsletter article that I wrote last month, dispelling the myths about the COAT Top 10 Awards. As Joyce mentioned, you know, it doesn't have to be new construction. Several of the winners in 2020 are existing buildings. And it really addresses all different types of programs in all different regions of the world, and it doesn't have to be more expensive. So I would encourage all of you to consider this and find yet another opportunity to recognize the great work that you're already doing.
And Julie, I recall your earlier slides also had a beautiful one of the African American Museum in DC, right next to the Washington Monument. I mean, that is another museum that is, you know, very well respected in this community. So I think that is another synergy there. I'll just quickly turn over to Chris to talk. I think go over again the kind of air quality checks that you have currently for the reentry, because it's expanded from what you previously track. This is something that I think this community do care about, because we also work with a lot of conservators.
Yeah, Joyce, thank you. I know that you've been leading on this issue of trying to get to it, to help museums kind of embrace the next generation of technology for managing indoor air quality. So when it comes to this issue of reentry, you're right. We included essentially 6 new metrics for air quality. Even the ones that look like the old ones, we have changed how we interpret them, and we have changed how we're analyzing them. So the bottom line is, as you said, we are looking at relative humidity, we're looking at CO2, we're looking for TVOC, and we actually have spec'd 3 kinds of PM, PM1, 2.5, and 10. And actually what's really notable, as many of you know, and many of your experience, when we were dealing with folks even 6 months ago, maybe 3 months ago, we were struggling to get people to think about the nominal condition was people were taking once a year indoor air quality measurements, probably on a physical sampling basis. However, and we were fighting within ARC to keep that, just to hold on to that. Now, the realization that air quality matters throughout the day, during the week, and over much finer temporal scales has changed that conversation. We're not arguing about whether air is necessary. and so what that has meant is we understand that many facilities might not be able to measure information in near real time. So what we've done is break the issue into 3 components. So for each of the 6 things I mentioned, we have been asking, 1, how much of your floor area is covered by measurement? So this can be accomplished by running around into each of your rooms and taking a measurement. So the issue is, do you have data on throughout your facility? Not just one spot, not just a sample, but throughout your facility. The second issue is trying to understand, trying to be representative of the time you are open. So for instance, if you are open, if you are operating, what fraction of hours do you have a measurement? And this is critical because this isn't compatible with our traditional running around taking a sample. And as you think about something like CO2 and ventilation, we know that those effects are specific to certain times of day. If you measure CO2 concentrations at 7 in the morning before anybody enters the facility, I bet you your readings will be great. If they're not great, we actually have a problem. And so the question is, how do you get yourself in a position where you can understand how your system is working? And only after those 2 things are in place are we worried about interpreting your performance against a health-based threshold. So the bottom line, Joyce, is that we try to give people a ladder, a crawl, walk, run sequence so that they can get started, even if they're using manual equipment, to understand why we're asking. We're trying to say, do you know about these things? And what are they a proxy for? It is the air quality measurements are not a direct measurement of risk. They are a proxy for something, whether it's ventilation, whether it's transmission, whether it's filtration, whether it's cleaning. And so we're trying to be clear about what we're a proxy for, try to give people an incremental approach, and while recognizing that we know it's hard. So Joyce, I hope that's, I mean, I know that you've been working with folks to work them down that road, but that's our intent at this moment. And I guess the last thing is we are working with a variety of partners to show that it's possible and increasingly affordable to populate that information.
Well, I have a comment about that for Chris, and you know, we know how tight budgets are in museums and how everyone is, you know, sort of stretched. And I'm thinking this is resources that have to be shifted in order to get these measurements at the times that are recommended.
Yeah.
You have feedback from facilities and how that's working?
I do. Let me put that in context too. So I think that the way that we think about reentry at the moment, and I'm happy to share more about how other people are thinking about this too, is saying, look, Item number one, if think about like a pyramid, don't skip to the end. There's a temptation to skip to the end and to think about, you know, quote unquote, the expensive stuff, the sensors or whatever. I would encourage us to flip that around. It starts with clear health-based plans, policies, and procedures, accountability and governance. That is the base of the pyramid. The next thing up is using your team to provide feedback about whether your practices are being done consistently. And then the third thing is measuring those physical conditions. Don't skip to the end. And those first two don't have a huge amount of cost. Yes, they have cost in terms of spending your time to do them. Okay, when it comes to the sensor type things, the issue is the cost points for these kinds of things as technology are falling. We are in the hundreds of dollars per unit type range. That said, what is expensive about them is the intelligence, is the system that they represent. Hiring someone to understand where and what to sense, where to do it, how to maintain it, how information flows through, particularly when you're covering a large facility. Are these expenses, one of the things I would do to put that in context is saying, how do these expenses compare to your fire detection system, to your AEDs, to the other things that exist in your space? We are at or below those levels. So depending on how you think about that infrastructure in an institutional building, your first aid equipment, your fire detection, your carbon monoxide detection, those kind of things, these issues are now below that level. Is that a lot or a little? Yes, they're significant. Are they telling you something important about your facility? Yes. So I don't have an answer to. I can tell you where the cost points are. I can tell you what drive the cost. I can tell you what they compare to. I can't necessarily tell you what the return on investment, because it's a bit like saying, what's the return on investment on your AEDs? Depends if someone falls. Depends if someone falls over or not. Anyway, so that's sorry, that's probably a too long a response. I'd love to hear from others, but that's a quick reaction. Oh, Deborah, I think you're muted for a second.
While we're waiting for more questions, I have one for Julie, and it's the nature of how museums are planned. Typically, planning and programming, and at least seed money funding, occur prior to selection of the architect and design team. And by the time the architect comes on board, the initial space plan, the stacking, the massing may already be determined. So in such a situation, what advice do you have for museum clients and designers? Oh, I need to unmute Julie, hold on. Come on. Okay.
Thanks, Deborah.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. I think it's never too late to define the vision and the goals of the project. Even if the functional requirements are all already set, how that is translated into reality requires real thinking on exactly what was stated earlier. You know, if you've got a finite bucket of money, how are you going to spend that money? And where is the best use of that money to meet the collective outcomes that the team has established together? And having those big team conversations with all the stakeholders, whether it's from the funders to the operators, to the curators, to even a couple of exhibit designers, you know, who might be testing different scenarios and wanting to understand the potential of the space, and even community members, you know, who's your number one target audience? You should always start a project off with that process, even if it may feel like it's too late, because the longer you wait to do that, the more ground you will lose and the more inefficient and ineffective you'll be as the project continues to limp along.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Judy, could you also talk a little bit about the exchange? I know it's a little bit granular, but it's data, you know, just as Chris has data about operations, the DDX, the exchange. for
Oh,
design.
the digital data exchange. Okay, so
Yes.
that's not a COAT initiative, but it is part of the American Institute of Architects.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to capture energy performance on buildings. Buildings are a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and operational carbon. And so if architects can declare and make a commitment that all the work that they're going to do is going to step down towards net zero carbon operationally, then collectively we will be able to transform and influence the built environment. So you can't manage what you can't measure. And so the DDX is a website. It also started as an Excel spreadsheet, but it is now a web-hosted platform that was developed in conjunction with the Department of Energy. Design teams every year go into this database and they self-report all of their work in design and construction document phases. And what that does is it helps us track year over year, is the needle moving in the right direction? You can also tag data in there with what type of project, what zip code you're in, what the size is, and even some of the design strategies that you've used. So if you wanted to go there and say, I'm going to build a museum in Nebraska, and I'm curious, you know, what's a reasonable goal that we should set? Or if our goal is already number one, you know, what's the target that we have to beat? Now, these are design metrics. They're as designed, verified either by energy model or baseline codes. The next step is actual performance. And so there is a spot in the DDX to capture the performance, but that relies on with partnership from the ownership and the operation team to provide that data, because the designers don't always have that information.
Right. Yeah.
Rest assured, though, that your confidential information for your project is secure. So if you put in a very specific search, museums in this particular zip code, if there aren't 5 returns, then no data gets spit back out. So, you know, the idea here is that we want to make the data accessible. We want to explore trends. We want to identify best strategies. But this is not a finger pointing game, or, you know, we don't want to make anybody insecure about sharing this data.
Mm-hmm. Is it ever published? I know as an architect, you know, we participate and we can pull data out, but is it published?
So the AIA issues an annual report summarizing all of the results at a high level. It comes in PDF form. You can find it on the AIA website. But if you were curious and you wanted to just go into the DDX and create an account and start poking around and looking for buildings in Nebraska, you can do that. There are all kinds of filters that you can turn on and off and search for different things.
Okay, so it's almost a kind of equivalent to what ARC is doing. But ARC is providing the data.
Well, ARC is, I won't speak for Chris, but ARC is very much focused on actual performance and not the design condition.
Right, but in terms of the transparency aspect of it, it's both transparent. We have a question here. How do fire suppression systems fit into the decarbonization goal for museums, such as certain outdated ones that have a high global warming potential? I'm trying to unmute Joyce. Come on.
It's a good question. It's probably a better question for Julie than myself, but I'll give a quick answer just on the issue of high GWP substances, which both refrigerants and fire suppression systems. It's actually a place where we do not track that in ARC today, but it is a bit of an oversight, and that it actually traditionally for museums, I've worked a bit as a commissioning and consultant on this issue, and the only property type to which refrigerant and refrigerant-like things are a significant fraction of the footprint is things like grocery and refrigerated warehouse. And so to the degree that it is unlikely to be more than a very low single-digit contributor to operating emissions, and it's typically an end-of-life issue. But so what I know about them is that, and it is an oversight that we don't currently support that in ARC, and it is unlikely to be a big issue unless you have substantial refrigeration in your space, but that's observation.
My observation is we sort of expect time to do its work, and then as the systems are updated, that these things become they get retired. But that's a much longer time frame than what we would like to see, which is change it now. But realistically, that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think this is another area too where codes and standards are also catching up. So, if we think about and how industry is lobbying codes and standards. So a lot of the flame retardants and fire protection embedded in some of our construction material may or may not be necessary. We chock full infant pajamas with flame retardants. The infants are not the ones that are smoking in bed. And it was the cigarette industry that prompted that. And not, hey, don't fall asleep while you're smoking. And so therefore we must have flame retardant couches, right? So I think it's this question of just zooming out and saying, what's important? What do we have to have? And then how do we lobby the local jurisdictions to allow what needs to be done to be done? You could say the same thing about water, right? If you wanted to do a regenerative water project, in some places you're not allowed to collect rainwater because that is a natural resource that belongs in the ground and therefore is a shared public resource, not the opportunity of the person that owns the building to do whatever they want with it. Or if you want to treat potable water on site, you have to have a municipal water utility certification. So sometimes these regulations are getting in the way, and through those conversations with the local authorities having jurisdiction, we can start to push the needle and evolve some of that.
And I would just add a reentry, I think, timely issue if any of you have come across in projects, because this community, we are very concerned about clean air. One of the strategies had been bipolar ionization, and there are people who are really concerned about the ozone potential of that particular strategy. The truth is, you just have to look a little closer. If you look for those that does not contain ozone, that is still a strategy that you could use to clean your air. But then again, I think it is all about us, in a peer group, sharing information so that we can all achieve our goals faster and safer.
Joyce, maybe to add to that just a little bit, I mean, one thing I would like to emphasize when it comes to reentry and that kind of thing is that what makes this reentry post-COVID so difficult is the consistency. It actually goes, Deborah, to your question as well about how, where do these things go in terms of return on investment? What is different about this is it's a consistency play. We have to be consistently good. And if we have learned from things like classrooms and other places where we have lots of IEQ, we know that we have lots of essentially undiagnosed failures of, say, mechanical systems. In this context, by the time we know we have an air damper problem or a ventilation problem, we will have had a series of events that could increase the spread of infectious agents, right? And so that before we might have just gotten away with that. But now we have an issue where we need to know sooner. And so I guess the bottom line is what I was trying to convey is this is an issue where it's going to challenge us to make sure our buildings are operating to our expectation more consistently than has been the case before. And that's going to require, it's not going to be as glamorous as superlatives. It's going to be less glamorous, but more important. and I think that's a real challenge. I think it's fundamentally the same as energy. It's not, the gains are not going to be glamorous. They're going to be everyday gains. But it's something that we have to think about as a group, for what it's worth.
Okay. So I just want to go back to questions that were sent in earlier, and we did reply to them on the chat box, but in case you missed them, the AIA Toolkit that is available on the AIA.org website, Framework for Excellence. And if we look at the chat stream, Julie had sent out the links for those. I think that was it. So are there any more questions? Wow. Well, I'm looking at the attendees list, and this is, you know, a huge turnout. I'm more than pleased. Sure you have no more questions. We have a stellar panel here. Okay. All right. This webinar is being recorded, and so check back in the space, the AAM website page in a couple of days, and I'm sure we will get our ducks in a row and get this recording out to you. I want to thank our panelists, Julie Hiramoto and Chris Pike, and my co-hosts, Joyce Lee, and the AAM for letting us set this webinar up, and to you all for participating. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the week. Thank you.
Bye-bye.